So Purim, the holiday I mentioned that has just come to a close, is a confusing and conflicted holiday. On the one hand, it's associated with costumes, with parties, with silliness. Even its deeper themes, turning things upside down, revealing what's hidden, finding joy in the unknown, are all on the lighter side compared to things like freedom or atonement. Purim is definitely our most fun holiday. And on the other hand, the Purim story itself is anything but fun. An evil advisor convinces an ego-driven and easily manipulated king to kill all the Jews. Not so fun. And even within that not so fun aspect of Purim, we've managed to find the fun by focusing on the fact that we were ultimately saved. Which, for the record, was a good choice. I think a Purim centered on the annihilation of Jews would probably be a bit of a downer. But by focusing on our ultimate salvation and on the fun parts of Purim more broadly, we avoid analyzing the threat that drives the entire story, a threat that continues today. And so tonight, now that Purim is officially over, but we're still in the shadow of Purim, I want to look at the Jew hatred that appears in the Purim story with the hope of better understanding how it might show up similarly today and what we can and should do about it. In chapter 3 in the scroll of Esther, we read that all the king's courtiers bowed down to Haman. Thank you. Who the king had recently promoted to the second highest office in the land. But Mordecai, the Jew, would not bow down to him. And so Haman became filled with rage. Instead of Haman taking out his rage on just Mordecai, we read in verse 6 of chapter 3, but he disdained to lay hands on Mordecai alone. Having been told who Mordecai's people were, Haman plotted to do away with all the Jews, Mordecai's people, throughout the kingdom of Ahasuerus. This is how antisemitism and, frankly, any hatred of an entire people works. Find the offending example within the group, and then generalize the problem to everyone who is in that larger group. But this prejudice, in order to be a real threat, needs to be combined with institutional power. So Haman goes to the king to plead his case to kill all the Jews. And I want you to listen carefully to how he describes the Jewish people. Quote, "There is a certain people scattered abroad and dispersed among the peoples of all the provinces of your kingdom. Their laws are different from those of all other people, and they do not keep the king's laws, so that it is not in the king's interest to tolerate them." Why do the Jews need to be killed, according to Haman? Because they are different from all other people. Now, to be clear, every group of people is different from every other group of people. That's how diversity works. But it's also how hatred works. People are more prone to hate a group that is perceived as different or foreign or other. But usually being different alone is not enough to elicit hatred. Those who are different also need to be cast as bad or dangerous. Which is why it makes it all the more interesting that Haman doesn't make any of those accusations. He simply says that these Jews are different and therefore cannot be tolerated. And I think this reveals a defining feature of Jew hatred in particular. It is a hatred, I believe, of difference itself. Jews, like any other group, are different. But Judaism, the Jewish religion, actively values and promotes difference, which means that Jews have come to be associated with difference itself, with the idea of difference. This is how Haman sees the Jews and how he describes them in the story of Purim. And if you're looking for compliance, obedience, conformity, and uniformity, like Haman is, then the Jews are the clear enemy and have got to go. A society that can embrace difference, that is liberal and pluralistic and allows for diversity of thought and belief and ideology, that is a society that is good for the Jews. It is why Jews have thrived in America. Any golden age of Judaism throughout our long history is directly tied to our living in an open, accepting society. And unfortunately, the inverse is also true. Any society or culture that doesn't encourage difference, that values dominance over debate, that seeks to rule by coercion rather than consensus, has not been good for the Jews. Jews are always negatively affected by an indifference and an intolerance to difference itself. Which brings me to this moment that American Jews find ourselves in, and this current administration's plan to combat anti-Semitism. Forget that 79% of American Jews did not vote for this administration to represent them. Forget that this administration threw out and actively disparaged the previous administration's plan to combat anti-Semitism that was crafted in consultation with over 1,000 Jewish leaders and practitioners, saying, and I quote, "It appears to have more to do with furthering the progressive left's obsession with LGBTQ+ and all other minorities than it has to do with anything substantive in countering anti-Semitism." Forget the content of the plan itself, which is singularly focused on one particular type of anti-Semitism, one that happens to conveniently align with this administration's goals, while ignoring all other aspects of anti-Semitism that would necessitate this administration to take a more critical turn inward. Forget that this plan does not address at all white supremacy or the anti-Semitism that animates those movements. And forget that the plan literally involves the criticism of Jewish leaders and institutions, calling out Jewish leaders by name and calling out, quote, significant components of the Jewish community for their complacency in fighting anti-Semitism. Forget all of that, if you can. And instead, just consider one simple question. What does it mean for any plan for combating anti-Semitism to be carried out by the same people who are openly promoting policies that are anti-immigrants, anti-LGBTQ folks, anti-DEI, and so much more, who seem to be attacking not just these people, but the very value of diversity. Diversity of nationality, diversity of race, diversity of sexuality, of gender orientation, even diversity of thought. At minimum, diversity is not a value that I have seen this administration actively uphold or promote, and certainly not within their plan to combat anti-Semitism. I want to be clear, I don't think that this administration is alone in seeking out homogenous spaces where dissent is discouraged. But this administration has supposedly taken on the mantle of combating anti-Semitism, which gives us Jews the right and the responsibility to look at it critically. If anti-Semitism, as our Purim story suggests, is fundamentally about intolerance and even hatred of difference, then the fight against anti-Semitism must be coupled with a fight for greater diversity, not less of it. You can go online and read the plan yourself, the Heritage Foundation's National Strategy to Combat Anti-Semitism. I read the whole thing. They called it, fittingly, ironically, painfully, Project Esther. That's the right reaction. They seem to have missed the point of the story. Yes, Esther saved the Jews, but she did so by confronting Haman, someone who could not tolerate difference or dissent. There are Jews who likely support Project Esther. Again, we're a people who tend to disagree with one another. That's okay, although I would say to those Jews what Mordecai says to Esther in chapter 4 of the Megillah. Quote, Do not imagine that you, of all the Jews, will escape with your life by being in the king's palace. As Yehuda Kurtzer, the president of the Shalom Hartman Institute, recently wrote in an op-ed, American Jewish safety is not only about managing our own interests, it is also about ensuring the fundamental stability of our country. Our safety as Jews here in America is tied to the liberal, democratic, and pluralistic norms of this country that have allowed us to live and thrive here in the first place. And any legitimate fight against anti-Semitism should respect both the diversity within the American Jewish community and within America more broadly. Jews are different from each other, so it follows that the hatred of Jews manifests in many different ways. We must remain committed to fighting all forms of anti-Semitism, not only the forms that map onto what is politically convenient. And more importantly, we must continue to fight for our core value of upholding difference. It is a primary central purpose of Judaism, and it just so happens to be in our own self-interest too. Shabbat Shalom.